Every time you hear a panel on AI, there are 5 people talking about how by next year, all jobs will go away. And it's just completely unrealistic. I think I've seen the challenges and realities of the enterprise AI world over the last decade. I think a lot of what we currently read about in the news is hype, unfortunately. They think AI will create 170 million jobs and displace 92 million jobs. So you basically at 78 million newly created jobs. I just don't think you need people producing thousands of pages of documents all the time. I mean, healthcare should be about doctors treating patients. It should not be about thousands of people doing medical coding.
Yo, it's the future, don't hit the snooze. AI is here giving humans the boost. Team Humans rolling, brains in the game with Dan Turchin. Y'all remember the name. People reign in the mix, no stopping the flow. Better work, better life, yeah, we're ready to go. Robots and humans, a collab, you know. Okay, let's start the show.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're listening. Welcome back to AI and the Future of Work. I'm your host, Dan Turchin, CEO of PeopleRain, the AI platform for IT and HR employee service. If you're not yet subscribed to the weekly newsletter, you should be. There's a link in the show notes. Let's first open up that listener mailbag. Here's one from Michael in Dallas, whose favorite episode is number 297. With Allison Baum-Gates, venture capitalist from Sempervirens. It was a great conversation. Talking about the secrets to a successful VC career. We'll share a link to that one in the show notes. Here is your AI fun fact for today. Nikki Goth-Toy writes on the Stanford Human-Centered AI blog that leading AI companies are pulling user conversations for training, which highlights privacy risks and a need for clearer policies. Anthropic recently made a quiet change to its terms of service for customers. Conversations you have with its AI chatbot will be used for training its large language models by default, unless you opt out. 6 other leading US companies also feed user input back into their models to improve capabilities. Some give consumers the choice to opt out, while others do not. If you share sensitive information in a dialogue with ChatGPT, Gemini, or just about any other frontier model, it likely will be collected and used for training, even if it's in a separate file that you uploaded during the conversation. This and just about everything published by the Stanford HAI Center is worth reading. I will, of course, share a link to more details. It's a good article. Here's my commentary on this one. Terms of service for all digital consumer products are intentionally opaque to ensure maximum flexibility, shall we say. As I say frequently on the podcast, if you're not paying, you are the product. Assume whatever you share with AI or any other online service will be used in perhaps relatively harmless ways, like ad targeting, and also possibly for harmful ways, including ones that could lead to identity spoofing, location tracking, or even surveillance by bad actors. It's never practical to read and understand the convoluted legal jargon in the terms of service, but as a habit, opt out of data sharing for model improvement, require your kids and loved ones to do the same, and consider how your data could be weaponized. As consumers, we have the choice to accept the risk because we like free services. In the experience of personalized content, just be hyper aware of the risk. Let's use the new era of ubiquitous AI to become more attuned to the fact that our data is valuable. AI only knows what we tell it, and we do have agency as humans. Of course, that's a topic we'll continue to unpack in future conversations. Now, shifting to this week. Matt Fitzpatrick is the CEO of Invisible Technologies, which recently raised $100 million and was ranked the number 2 fastest growing AI company in 2024, having scaled to $134 million in revenue. The Invisible Technologies platform has been used to improve models for over 80% of the world's top AI companies, like Microsoft, AWS, and Cohere. It's absolutely widely known as one of the hottest AI and data companies on the planet. Matt was previously global head of QuantumBlack by McKinsey, where he led over 1,000 engineers to help organizations scale AI. He holds a BA in politics from Princeton, go Tigers, and an MBA from Wharton, go Quakers. And without further ado, Matt, it's my pleasure to welcome you to AI and the Future of Work. Let's get started by having you share a bit more about your background and what led you to Invisible Technologies.
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me. I guess at this point, I've been working in AI for about 12 years, probably before it was really called AI. I think 10 to 12 years ago, it was referred to more as data analytics. And I think I really started from the standpoint of most organizations in the enterprise over the last decade have really struggled to get any usable insights or business intelligence on what's happening in their companies. If you think about like societally, we spend a lot of time producing documents and producing custom analytics to tell you pretty basic things. And so I think I spent 10 years ago now, I felt at McKinsey that we needed a lot more engineering horsepower to actually do that in a scaled way. And so I think when I started, the firm had less than 100 engineers. By the time I left, they had about 7,000. And I oversaw a pretty good chunk of that, doing all of the kind of data infrastructure and all the kind of Gen AI work globally. And it was a pretty interesting journey. I mean, I think I've seen the challenges and realities of the enterprise AI world over the last decade. I think a lot of what we currently read about in the news is hype, unfortunately. I think the model performance has improved dramatically by 60 to 70% over the last couple of years, depending on how you cut it. But the adoption curve is much harder, will continue to be much harder. And I think I lived that for a decade because I was trying to do that in the machine learning days, which you saw all the same challenges of actually adoption. And figuring out how to work through that requires a whole host of different tools beyond just pure technology, change management, aligned incentives, and kind of actually knowing how to mobilize an organization around a goal. So that's a lot of what I've spent the last decade doing.
I know QuantumBlack may not represent kind of what most of us think about McKinsey, but on paper, it looks like where you came from versus where you are now are kind of polar opposites. What has been the most challenging aspect of adapting to the culture and taking a leadership role at Invisible Technologies versus McKinsey?
Yeah, so there's actually a lot more similarities than you think. The group I led, QuantumBlack Labs, built most of the internal kind of machine learning products, data products for the firm. And, as I said, people don't really think about the fact that McKinsey had 7,000 engineers building things for clients, but that is a huge chunk of what the firm did. And in many ways, if you took the last 10 years, the largest AI companies in the world in the enterprise have been businesses like Accenture, Palantir, and then I think QuantumBlack was up there in a lot of ways. And so the interesting thing for me in that whole experience set was the challenges of how to get AI working in the enterprise is what I've spent a lot of my time doing. Now, the organizational differences of running a startup company are very different, as you correctly point out. So I think that involves everything from raising capital to managing a team that is both incredibly dedicated, anxious, and focused. And I think there's real differences in the kind of dedication and emotional volatility of a startup team. I actually think it's one of the most powerful things about it is just you get emails from people at 10 p.m. on a Saturday night because they just care so much. And that is a very different environment than like the traditional consulting world. So I think there's capital raising. I think there's the kind of emotional bandwidth of the team. I think the organizational design is the other really big one. I think that I've done some pretty non-traditional things in how I've built the organizational structure of the company, but I think a lot, like my number one guiding goal is reducing decision velocity so that your kind of throughput and speed of doing things is as fast as possible. So we have almost no standing meetings. We try and move most of our team's time to be with customers or building products. But a lot of what I've tried to think about, having spent a decade working across the enterprise, is you can just live in meeting inertia. Like any company that has everyone spending 10 hours a day in consecutive meetings is not building anything. And so we spend a lot of time thinking about how to cut that down and make sure the whole team is rowing in a similar direction to build things fast. I think I heard a quote recently that the number one determining factor of who wins in the AI era will be learning velocity, and I think that's really stuck with me. I think it's something that we think about a lot is just the feedback loop of what you learn and how you push it to your teams is a lot of the driver of success, and how you build around it, and that's a lot of what we think about.
You use 3 adjectives that make me know that you've been officially indoctrinated into the world of hypergrowth startups. They're emotional, powerful, and volatile. Never heard a better description of the entrepreneurial journey. So congrats. You earned your stripes. So I referenced in the background on Invisible Technologies, 80% of some of the leading models have been improved using the company's technology.
Yeah.
Maybe just pick a success story that makes you most proud.
Yeah.
Just help the audience understand what you do.
Yeah, so maybe I'll just give 2 seconds on the overall. We're a modular AI software platform, and we have basically 4 main platforms. Neuron, which takes fragmented, unstructured, and structured data, brings it together, cleans it. Atomic, which then can build processes off those data. So think about something like merchant onboarding. Axon, which can train AI agents on specific workflows and specific tasks within those workflows. And then we have an expert marketplace of 1.1 million experts on any topic on Earth that we can bring to bear to actually train and validate AI models. And then Synapse, which is an evaluation and fine-tuning platform, which we use to say, how do I look at any model and actually do the statistical validation to say, this 10-page output is correct or incorrect? If you thought of like a legal document, how do I go line by line and say, this clause looks right, this clause looks incorrect? We do that all with our annotation platform paired with our marketplace. So there's 2 kind of different motions the business has. We train all of the large language models and emerging model builders. And so think of that as folks that are building a model and they want to test and validate the outputs of that. We do the reinforced learning for that on Synapse. And then the second part of that, which is actually pretty symbiotic, is we build enterprise applications using the suite of platforms I mentioned for enterprise customers. And so that to give a practical example of that, Swiss Gear, Swiss Army luggage, if you think of it that way, we did all their inventory forecasting. So the question they had is, if you think about the large majority of SKUs that they're launching or ordering every year, and you have a multi-month lead time for that, and then you have revenue that's going to be materializing a couple months later, depending on who buys what. And so that is a very important forecasting process, because it means that if you under-order certain SKUs, you can miss revenue. If you over-order certain SKUs, you can end up with lots of excess inventory, both of which are bad. And so we use Neuron, our data platform, to bring all of that data, to bring all the different siloed. I think we generated something like a couple hundred 700 data tables in a couple of weeks that allowed them to map all the relevant data to do the forecasting. And then we built a forecasting engine that basically doubled the number of SKUs they were able to accurately forecast, which is a pretty material impact on the bottom line, and allow them to interact with it using GenAI with certain questions to interact with the data and understand different permutations and scenarios. And so the interface uses a lot of GenAI in how they can access it as well. But I think that the big thing I'd highlight there is that is a hyper-customized workflow that we built for them, but we do it on a similar suite of platforms, Neuron on the data side, Atomic on the process builder, and then custom AI agents with Axon.
One of the things that is super opaque to consumers of AI is the model training process.
Yeah.
And this gives me a good opportunity to ask an expert this question. I think the topic kind of flared up last year with the acqui-hire of scale by Meta.
Yeah.
Kind of the value of data labeling. You mentioned one of the 4 products is a marketplace of, I think you said 1.1 million experts. Talk about the role of those experts and the role of data labeling in model management.
Yeah, so I think that there's a concept of data labeling, which is the more commoditized, like cat, dog, to use a quote from the show Silicon Valley. What we're talking about here is a much more complex, what's called reinforced learning human feedback, which is the process of actually, for any given model output, assessing a rubric for what makes that good, and then finding relevant experts to go through and work through that rubric. And so an example of that might be, let's take a legal document, because I mentioned that earlier. If you wanted to generate, a simple thing like an ISDA agreement or something like that, or a rental lease agreement, let's use that because it's an easy one, right? You'd bring in a legal expert who'd say, let me look at the framework of what a lease agreement should include. It should include these main dimensions. It should have, these are the big important clauses that matter. These are the major dispute points, but you need some way to develop what a rubric should look like. And then you actually will source experts on that topic to go review when the model generates different permutations, does that look right or wrong? And I think what's interesting about our expert pool, about 30% of it is master's and PhD level experts. So it is very much a reasoning task-based pool. I think of this as much of the most interesting knowledge bases in the world are now being channeled to actually assess and validate these models, which is how they're improving so much over the last couple of years. And so literally think of it as you have a set of expert humans going through and validating any topic on Earth you can imagine, and that can relate to video, it can relate to audio. An example might be you want a German speaker to evaluate an audio sample and say, is this correct in how it formulates a sentence and the tone of voice so what's interesting is the topics you can cover for training are almost infinite if you take the number of languages you can imagine, the number of different topics one could train. So think of like computational biology in Hindi, for example, versus computational biology in English. But then I think the other really interesting one is culture. And so what I mean by that is French, Lebanese, French, Canadian. It's actually a different language in a lot. Even if you take within the U.S., the way that people speak by state is quite different. And so these are language models. And so the actual validation becomes incredibly contextually unique as you go deeper onto those different vectors of language, culture, and expertise topic.
I frequently say on this show that AI only knows what we teach it. And that's a really clear articulation of why when we ground it in trustworthy content, we can trust the outputs much more.
I completely agree with that comment. It also, what is true or what is necessary for it to know changes on a regular basis. And that's one of the most interesting things. It is not a static. It is not like in a machine learning context, you train a pricing model and that pricing model works forever. You have interesting things like take a healthcare model pre-GLP-1s and a healthcare model post-GLP-1s. It's actually a different knowledge context. And I think that's one of the really interesting things is as society learns, the models learn with it. And so that learning process is continuous. And that's why I'm actually, there's, for all the discussion of like human knowledge kind of not being needed in the future, I actually think this is a continuous 20-year learning journey in a lot of ways.
We call ourselves Team Human on this podcast for that reason.
I am me as well.
Yeah. Welcome to the club.
Today's episode is brought to you by my company, PeopleRain. As you hopefully know, PeopleRain is the AI platform that automates work. Tens of millions of employees around the world get back 4 to 6 hours per week because PeopleRain automates away the friction. Imagine a world where your teams never have to wait for technology upgrades or to have a human reset their password or get added to a distribution list, or get help with payroll, PTO, or benefits. Inbox zero for the help desk, zero friction for employees. That's the future of work. That's PeopleRain. We're offering all members of Team Human, and hey, that's you, our listeners, an exclusive discount on PeopleRain just for being part of this amazing community. Get the discount code at peoplerain.io/podcast. That's PeopleRain, like the reign of a king or queen, .io/podcast. Now back to this week's conversation.
You are in an interesting catbird seat in that you can go beyond the headlines, the infamous 95% MIT study. I think that's done a disservice to humanity. But it got us talking about why so many enterprise implementations, AI initiatives have or are failing. What do you think distinguishes not the 5 from the 95, but the ones that are successful from the ones that aren't?
Yeah, it's funny. I hear a lot of debate. People have asked me numerous times about the statistical methodology for that study, and there's a lot of debate on it. I would say that based on my decade of enterprise experience, it rings very true in an approximate percentage. Like I do think that it is not more than 5% making it to production. And I think, the simple fact I can give you is I speak to very senior people in enterprises all the time. And if you ask the simple question of name the number of projects or number of big deployments that are making material EBITDA impact that you have in production, it is an extremely low number. And I think to your question, there's a couple reasons for that. And I'll describe the problems and then I think what I've seen solve them. Some of which actually is quoted in the MIT study. The problems are a couple-fold. One, messy data. So you cannot build working AI on messy data, which is part of why a lot of the foundation of what our company is built on is data cleaning, data foundations. I think if the input data is not clean, meaning if you can't have like a single unique ID for a customer across 10 systems, you can't really build an e-commerce. You can't really build an AI model off that. So I think data is the biggest challenge. And, particularly for bigger companies, I think a lot of the challenge there is 70% of the software in the world is over 20 years old. It's highly fragmented. It's messy. So you have these, one way I've described it is layers of sediment that have been built up over the last 30 years. and you're trying to build modern AI on 30 years of sediment, it's hard. And so I think data is one big challenge. I think the definition of accuracy and correctness is much harder than people understood in the Gen AI era. And it gets a little bit to how I talked about model training, which is there was a pretty well understood paradigm for how to deploy machine learning. So if I take something like a credit underwriting model, and I want to say, should I approve or reject a credit? People have understood how I backtest that, how I train it, and they'd say, this is a model where I can trust, I can deploy that. But if I said to you, let's take the same example, generate a 100-page document on a commercial credit agreement and make sure that document is a good document. Well, you get into all sorts of interesting questions like what defines a good document? What are the risky parts of the document? Is it semantic? Is it context? Like, what are the definitions of a good clause or a bad clause? And so I think you have one, messy data, two, an unclear definition of good, which is a lot harder than people expected. I think that the third is kind of workflow redesign and actually how you go about doing that. So the analogy I'd give is if you take exactly the way you work now and you add AI to it, you're not really going to move the needle much at all. In fact, like you're probably going to, it's like if you took a line in a factory and you saved everyone 12 minutes per day, the factory hasn't improved at all in efficiency. It's just a factory with 12 extra minutes that people can have a slightly longer lunch break. I think where you get real efficiency is you say, how should I work today? And I think this gets a lot of the future of work. Like, what is the way I should re-architect myself based on the tools I have? I think that one is a huge part of why many of the startup companies are so far outpacing traditional companies in their usage. I actually heard one of the model builders giving a stat the other day that at a startup, the tokens per employee is about 7x at a traditional company, which gives you a sense of like the rate of usage gap. And that's because those companies are architecting themselves around Gen AI. It's a very different thing to say, I'll use commercial credit because I was using it. Like, this is how I do my credit process today. Let me see if I can fit AI into it, to then saying, what's the information I need to collect to underwrite a credit? How quickly can I make that flow work? And where do I want to add Gen AI, and where do I want to add human thought in that process? So, number one, messy data. Number two, definition of good. Number three, the actual workflow redesign. And then I'll get to the most important one, which is actually both the most important and the solution of where I've seen this work, which is a lack of business ownership. That is the single biggest challenge. Is society, enterprise, corporate America, and actually most, even let's say Russell 5000 type companies, have all been built up with a technology team over here and a business team over here, right? And those have been very intentionally separate. You have people that do the function of the business, and the IT function is mostly about enabling them, providing tools, maybe doing data here and there, but they're not designed to be embedded alongside the business people. And in particular, many of the business leaders don't always want to take operational ownership of tech initiatives. Like they signed up for business jobs, that's what they're comfortable with. And so the biggest challenge by far has been a siloing of Gen AI initiatives to the tech team. And what that basically creates is a standalone tower that does not have any relationship to what the business need is, that swirls around and doesn't get anything. And that's why the standard thing of I have hundreds of projects I'm working on, but none in production happens, is because no business person is willing to accept that. And so given that set of problems, the answer of where I see this working is really one thing, which is top-down CEO or business-led ownership of driving this. So the formula, the folks that are getting real value out of this, it's not the technology. It's I have a business leader that says tomorrow, I'll keep going with the commercial credit analogy because I've used it a couple times. I have a leader who says tomorrow I want to do commercial credit, Gen AI led, and I'm going to hold my team to operational KPIs, to a certain throughput, to a re-architecting of the process, and they move the organization. And they don't worry about tech questions like what platform should I pick. They say what is the business goal? What are the KPIs? How do I track it? So I think usually I can tell when an organization is making progress versus not by some simple questions like, what are the business KPIs you're doing to drive this? Who's the operational leader of the initiative? How are they? Do you have engineers co-located alongside them? All those kind of questions. The minute the conversation starts with like, we are in the process of selecting a platform, we've got a 5-month decision process on the Gen AI architecture we want to sit about, what that usually means is they're going to spin, because it's not being led with a business outcome. It's being led with a kind of theoretical, technical question that will frankly just never get solved.
Really good answer. That was very thorough. Thank you. To 900 million consumers, AI looks like ChatGPT, and it writes haikus about cats, and it makes invitations for your kid's birthday party. Well, I'll pause there. Maybe you had something to add on.
Well, no, and look, what you're saying is very right, which is I think this is why everyone is so confused, is something like 65% of U.S. consumer, or actually global consumers, use Gen AI on a weekly basis. I mean, the adoption paradigm in the consumer world has been like nothing we've ever seen. It's the fastest growing technology ever. And I think part of the reason for that is the adoption risk for a consumer is very low, right? Like if you're searching for what is a good restaurant to visit in London, you go, it's a much easier way to consume that information. You do it. And so everyone has started using it. Summarization. If you think about the average school now, everyone uses it for summarization of their coursework, things like that, of their syllabuses. But if you think about an enterprise, like you could go any different, but if I'm like I'm an insurance claims business, or I'm a law firm, any of these different topics, you need the outcome to be perfect. You need it to be high precision, high reliability, deterministic, and that is harder to do. And that requires customization, configuration, workflow change. And so I think you have a dynamic where everyone's kind of hoping this would just be something they could buy out of a box and change everything. And that's why the societal kind of the enterprise change has not been there yet. We're very early days in it.
You took that one and ran with it. Matt, you can attest, we did not rehearse this, but you saw where I was going. I mean, you walk into the four walls of the office, and it's like you're back in the Stone Ages. Like, to the average employee, it is difficult to appreciate the friction. Once you have that business project identified, there's security that needs to approve of the data, and there's a CFO that needs to understand the financial impacts, and there's just organizational change management because employees are apprehensive that they're training their replacement, their digital. So like there's these layers of complexity. Like, yeah, just maybe expand on like in the trenches what the real impediments are to making these projects successful. Yeah,
I do think, it's interesting, the training, the digital replacement. I do think one of the most unhelpful things of this has been, every time you hear a panel on AI, there are 5 people talking about how by next year, all jobs will go away and, everything is being changed. And it's just completely unrealistic. It is off by an order of magnitude on timeline. We're talking about what is really a 5 to 10 year change that people are talking about as a 1-year change. And so one of the weird permutations of that, or kind of results of that, is that rather than people thinking about, this is an amazing technology that I can embed and use to make myself more productive and use to make my company more productive. And what's ended up happening is you do have real like workplace fear where people are afraid. And so you almost have an employee rejection of it in some ways, driven by a kind of a societal narrative that is completely incorrect. And I think that, there's all sorts of data on this, whether, do you know what Jevons paradox is?
Yeah.
So I'm a huge believer in that, and there's like numerous examples of this. One of the most interesting ones I heard recently is bank tellers. So bank tellers, there's various technology 30, 40 years ago that took most functional kind of tasks being performed by a bank teller and automated all of them. But do you know how many bank tellers there are today? There's actually more than there were back then, because what ended up happening was, by automating the functional tasks, you increase stuff like relationship building, the number of customers they could. And so what actually happened was, in that world, people had a lot more relationships that they formed in their local branches. And so the return on bank branches went way up. So everyone opened more bank branches. And you can take the same dynamic, you can apply it to accounting. Like pre-Excel, everyone spent all their time calculating revenue on a slide rule. And now people do really advanced analytics with as far as Excel goes, at least. And there are more accountants than there were in 1980 pre-Excel. And so that's the analogy I would say over and over will be, and what Jevons paradox says, that any advanced technology will lead to more and more consumption of that technology. And people will be able to spend time on much more value-add tasks like relationship building, product development. And so I think that's been the really ironic thing about this is a lot of the alarmism, which you can even put together what you think the implication of jobs are. That the adoption curve is not going to support what a lot of that alarmism says. Like we are years away from most of these enterprise cycles really. And by the way, I think folks are having some degree of it, but it's taking time. And I think that's a very normal adoption curve if you look at why machine learning took a long time. And machine learning took a long time and it has had material impacts. So like, I think about, mortgage underwriting as an example of major adoption. It's been a huge change for society driven by machine learning, but that took, half a decade, even a decade to really permeate. And so I think that's been the weird thing is that here's a funny way I think about society. We have become as a society, a group of people producing 900-page documents for other people to read 900-page documents, none of which actually gets read. Like society just has way too much paperwork and administration. Like one of my favorite examples of this, you take healthcare. We spend as the US, we spend $15,000 per patient in the US compared to about $3,000 in Germany and Canada. About a third of that is administration cost, medical coding. It's just paperwork. And if you could take out that cost base and dramatically increase the quality of care in the US and then reduce all the time spent medical, that's a really good thing for society. And so I think that is the unfortunate thing is a lot of the societal narrative around this change has created alarmism that's stopping us from seeing what I think are actually really positive trends in society from this stuff. And I think that's a shame in a lot of ways.
There's a small but growing community of voices who are sharing data like that and helping kind of address the legitimate, but the growing fears that employees have. It really is incumbent on us. And with that answer, I'm going to give you a promotion. You're now a captain on Team Human, right? You get to go out and flip the coin, all right? So a kind of a corollary and very important topic related to that answer is exercising AI responsibly. A lot about kind of shifting the narrative from, what AI is doing to you to what AI is doing with you or for you. Really, relies on us earning the trust of employees. And we talk a lot on this podcast about responsible AI.
Yep.
And we'd love to just know in Matt world, like what is responsible AI and how do you navigate the nexus between like what we can do versus what we should do?
Yeah. So first of all, this is something we care an enormous amount about at Invisible as well. I mean, in many ways, our company is built on the idea of statistical testing, validation, and responsible AI and governance. So completely agree. I think one misconception about AI is actually more fair than humans if governed responsibly. And what I mean by that is you can create guardrails to ensure that the implementation of it links to whatever outcome or input data you link it to. And a simple example I mentioned, mortgage underwriting is a good one. Think of 25 years ago, if you went into a bank branch and you asked for a mortgage, your determination of whether you got a mortgage or not was determined by the individual in that bank branch and the decision they came to. And then what we've had over the last couple decades is a movement to doing much of the decisioning on mortgages in the US to a machine learning model that is extremely governed and by the federally regulated, and it doesn't allow things like redlining. And so what's happened is we moved to a paradigm of mortgage underwriting is a fair process based on a preset set of inputs that avoids and ensures you don't have things like bias in the way the underwriting decision happens. And that is the nice thing about AI is that it's a simple formula, the data inputs that go into it, the governance framework, and an output you're trying to achieve. And it's actually something that is very effective when you know what the objective is. Now, I think one of the challenges a lot of the discussion around regulation has not related to objectives. It's related to governing the technology itself, which is actually, here's a challenge on that. You have hundreds of different countries, all with different views on that. You have hundreds of different sectors, all with different views on that. The technology is moving at an insane pace every couple of months. And so what I think you end up realizing is you can't regulate the technology itself. There's Mustafa Suleyman has this book, The Coming Wave, where he talks about this. With any advanced technology that's multinational, you can't really regulate if one country says you can't advance technology, then other countries do advance it, it doesn't work, right? So I think of this as two different things: the frameworks of how we implement and govern and make sure it's safe, and then the actual outcomes we're trying to achieve as a society and how to make sure those are fair. And so the two different examples I would give on that is there are many paradigms for governance frameworks that have worked really effectively in other societal contexts. So the internet, protocols like the internet, aviation, crypto, cyber, all of these examples, you created standard frameworks and protocols for how a technology should be implemented. You created a lot of interoperability, and those kind of standards actually work across borders, and they set norms on, model context protocol is one good example of this. But when you have a standard way to build and a standard set of ways to think about data, model development, evals, and governance frameworks, then you actually, I think, get to a world where everyone is kind of singing from the same song sheet, and that does work as a building framework. I mean, once standards are agreed on, like aviation, then everyone tends to move to those, and you do have kind of safe model development protocols in that way. I think then the second part of that is you think about, like, what are the societal goals you're trying to achieve? So I mentioned kind of healthcare cost as one, right? Like, you could think about, the K through 12 educational gap, and that being like in STEM in the US, that's a huge problem right now. And you could create governance framework around how to think about applying Gen AI in educational centers, right? And what are the situations in which you allow it in public schools to be used, in which context, in which subjects. So I actually think that's the key thing. It's not, you can't regulate the development of a technology moving at the pace it is now, but you can absolutely say, number one, what are the frameworks of how we want to build it? And then number two, something like mortgage underwriting, how do I make sure that the way mortgage underwriting is implemented is fair? And you could apply that same logic to curriculums in computer science in K through 12. You could apply it to, one of my favorite examples of where I think it should be applied is NIMBY regulations for building in the US. So like the actual way that we review development of critical infrastructure and housing. I mean, right now, the governance of that is terrible in the US. Like, we have no idea why certain housing projects get approved and others don't, why certain bridges take 10 years and some get 6 months. I honestly, half of that is probably certain people being paid off and a whole host of other things that are not fair right now. And I think it would be far better if that, as an example, had very transparent outcome-based governance frameworks that we link to AI, just as an example. And I do think this is where AI is extremely fair if you're clear on the outcome you are trying to achieve with it as a society.
Really well said. I firmly believe that legislation will always trail innovation. And it is up to us as vendors that are training these models and deploying these solutions in the enterprise and impacting, potentially billions of lives, to hold ourselves accountable.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's conversations like this. You got a lot of entrepreneurs listening, a lot of investors. As a community, we need to say, this is the future we want for our kids and loved ones, and we have an enormous amount of responsibility to define that future.
Absolutely. And look, I think the other thing I'd note there is, particularly in enterprise and public sector context, like, trust matters an enormous amount. So I think that actually being a company that really stands up for well-governed, safe, secure AI is really important.
Yeah. I got to get you off the hot seat, but you're not going anywhere without answering one last important question for me. I ask this frequently, but it's always interesting to get guest perspective.
Yeah.
One thing that will be fundamentally different at work in a decade that today, even with as fast as, we're innovating today, would seem like science fiction in 2026.
So I think if you think about the function of work today, take any big company. How much of the day is spent on administration versus work? I would say in most jobs, it's at least half administration right now. It's just filling out documents, it's producing. And so, and a simple example of this is 3 years ago, if I told you I prepared a 400-page document for this meeting, you'd be like, wow, that's a lot of preparation. But what I think is happening, that is a very good thing, is we are moving away from the idea that large amounts of material production relates to any useful business outcome. Like, a business outcome is about building a product people want, selling it well, marketing it well, having engineers that build it well. I mean, there are really functional task-based things related to a business outcome. And I think that over the last 25 years, as we built up much of the kind of modern technology infrastructure, or kind of not modern, old technology infrastructure business, administration just became a soul-crushing amount of our time. And so I think part of the reason you've seen a lot of younger people leave corporate America and kind of go off on these different jobs is people just don't want to spend days at a time producing documents. And so I actually think the really positive thing a couple years from now is people will spend a lot more time on core business functions. Like, you'll have a lot more entrepreneurs. I think there's a lot of stuff written about how, like, the cost to start a company now has gone down so much because you can spin up a cloud, you can spin up all these new tools, you can spin up, an LLM or a coding app and, do the work of 4 engineers. And I think those are all very real. And so I think we are moving away from a society that in like the 1990s was like basically everyone doing a series of kind of administrative tasks anchored around a core function of a business, to a lot more entrepreneurs, a lot more small companies, and a lot more people doing work that is fundamentally interesting. And a crazy stat I heard the other day is that, and I'm not saying this is where I think society should go, but it's still interesting, is that the Wall Street Journal published that 9% of the U.S. population is full-time social media influencers. Shocking, right? I mean, I still can't. But yeah, that is what the journal published. But I say that as an interesting example.
Self-described, I assume.
Self-described, yeah. I mean, who knows if anyone's actually watching them? But I think what's interesting about that is it just gets the idea that even the definition of entrepreneurship, the way that people engage, the way media works. Think about the podcast, by the way. It's another example of this. I just think the function of commerce will change to be much more about business-related topics rather than document production. I think that's a really good thing. I just don't think you need people producing thousands of pages of documents all the time. I mean, healthcare should be about doctors treating patients. It should not be about thousands of people doing medical coding.
That's what it should be. I hope it doesn't take us a decade to get there, but today it seems ambitious.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, look, again, this is why I do think that the societal change is going to take a lot longer than we expected. And I think that one of the interesting results of that is that has both negatives and positives. Like, I think the change will take longer, but actually, like, just an example, the World Economic Forum came out with this data recently that they actually think 100. This is stats I've seen, but they think AI will create 170 million jobs and displace 92 million jobs. So you basically at 78 million newly created jobs, and I think that's exactly where we're going. It's going to take a decade. Over that time, we'll create new jobs, we'll replace jobs, and we will end up with a different societal paradigm for work. And I think that one of the implications of that is the people that kind of try and avoid it and stonewall AI, that is the only negative, is just not learning how to use these tools because everyone else around you will.
Takes a little bit of a leap of faith, a little bit of imagination to counter the kind of popular narrative, but I so agree with you. I've done kind of personal data analyses. I looked at just kind of the how self-driving cars are disrupting the transportation industry, and the World Economic Forum data holds up for that. It's like 10-1 in the next decade in terms of jobs created versus eliminated. And pick any industry, but it takes a little bit of imagination.
Yeah, I think one of the things there is the lost productivity of a good chunk of America spending a ton of time in traffic every day on its own is like an enormous productivity drain on society that gets improved by that, as an example.
Yeah. Matt, we're out of time. This was fantastic. Where can the audience learn more about you and the great work that you and the team are doing?
Yeah, sure. Come to our website anytime, invisibletech.ai, and always feel free to reach out to me as well. But we are we are real optimists that it's going to be a really interesting 10-year journey for AI, and we care deeply about making sure that that AI is safe, responsible, and well governed. So look forward to discussing that more.
I want you to go out and change the world and then come back and tell us about it. All right. You got an open invite. Come back and hang out sometime.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
All right. Well, there you have it. The newest captain of Team Human, Matt Fitzpatrick. And that's all the time we have for this week on AI and the future of work. I'm your host, Dan Turchin from PeopleRain. And of course, we're back next week with another fascinating guest.
Yo, it's the end of the show. Time to power it down. AI's the sis, but humans wear the crown. Team Human in the house, got the vibe so clever. Dan Turchin from PeopleRain, making us better. We learned about AI for humans. We're ready to conquer the future. That's all for now. See you next time.